ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بعد أسابيع من الاضطرابات عرفنا أخيرا من هم المرشحين الأربعة لانتخابات البيت الأبيض، وحتى لا تتغير قائمة المرشحين من جديد نأمل أن لا يقع حدث آخر غير متوقع، كارثة غير منظورة، محاولة اغتيال قرار بالانسحاب من السباق. الآن ومع امتلاء خزائن الحملتين بالمال نباشر السباق إلى البيت الأبيض. في العادة يصل الناخب إلى قراره الأخير قبل أسابيع من موعد الانتخابات، كما تظهر الاستطلاعات تغييرا طفيفا بين قرارات الناخبين بين شهري سبتمبر ونوفمبر. لكن هذه السنة مختلفة، وذلك لأن المرشحة الديمقراطية كامالا هاريس لم تكن السنة الماضية في الانتخابات التمهيدية، وهي ليست معروفة لأمريكيين كثيرين، مما يعني أن الشهرين القادمين أهمية أكثر مما كانت عليه الحال في سنوات الانتخاب السابقة. أين سيركز المرشحون اهتماماتهم؟ وكيف سينفقون ملايين الدولارات في حملاتهم؟ وما الأمور التي سيركزون عليها؟ وما هي الأمور التي سيتجنبونها؟ لبحث شؤون الشهرين المقبلين قبل موعد الانتخابات الأكثر جنونا في تاريخ أمريكا، يسرني أن أستضيف واحد من السياسيين المميزين، بيل كريستول.
Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. If a week can be a lifetime in politics, then we've just lived through a few generations in the American political history. I'm delighted to have Bill Kristol, one of America's wisest and most insightful experts on politics, to help explain everything that's gone on in our country in the last few weeks. Bill, welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Welcome to our new stage. You were one of our first guests almost 20 years ago, and I'm delighted to have you inaugurate this new position here.
Very pleased to be with you, and I don't think I can explain everything that's happened in America politics, but a pretty amazing roller coaster, huh?
So we now have clarity on who will be competing in November. So we now have two people about the same age, a black woman from a city and a former rural, middle-aged white former congressman, now governor, and then two white guys, very far apart in age, very different histories on the Republican side. What does this tell us about the choice facing America?
It's hard to know what it tells us, honestly, but let's step back for a minute. Donald Trump was cruising ahead of Joe Biden after Joe Biden's terrible debate performance on June 27th, the assassination attempt on July 13th, right? That sympathy for him, he looked at first like he was going to use it to be a more unifying figure. Then there's the Republican convention, which goes pretty well for him. He selects Vance as his vice president. Come back to that in a minute, perhaps. And then Biden gets out of the race on the Sunday right after that. Biden, that's how confusing everything is. Harris has selected her vice presidential pick.
First, she gets the nomination.
She gets the nomination officially, and then selects the vice president. So that's a lot of turmoil, and it has been reflected in the polls. I think the most important thing one can say, just analytically, is Trump was 3 points probably nationally ahead of Biden when Biden got out. That was enough to give him a comfortable electoral college victory. He's now, in most of the national polls, about 3 points behind Vice President Harris, which probably makes it about a toss-up race in the Electoral College. So we have that's a substantial move. This has been a race that's been very stable. We're a very polarized country, and voters don't change their mind very much. To have 6% movement, so Harris did shake up the race. I think that's important to say, because one of the big questions when she took over from Biden was, well, would it make a difference? I mean, she's his vice president. People have their opinions about the Biden-Harris administration. As I say, they have their opinions about Trump. It might have been the case that she wouldn't change things much. Right, but I think the fresh face, the new face there has changed things quite a bit.
Let's follow with your opening remark here. 6% shift. Who are these people that thought one thing in the middle of July and now think something differently?
They are people for whom Biden's age was a huge problem. That they did not feel, they didn't approve of Biden's job performance. That was problem A. And problem B was they did not feel comfortable voting for him for another 4 years as president at age 82. And they already were concerned about his age and his aging. And then the debate on June 27th really put an exclamation point on that. So I don't think that's irrational. I would personally still have voted for Biden, but I mean, it wasn't crazy for people who were more on the fence to say, that's just, I can't do that. And they seem to have been pleased by the change to Harris, relieved in some cases, and reassured, I'd say, by Harris so far. I mean, the first thing that happened was just a sigh of relief. It's Harris, not Biden. It's a 59-year-old, not a 81-year-old. But the second thing that happened pretty quickly was, well, is she up to it? She wasn't a great candidate in 2019. She took some foolish positions in the primary there to try to cater to the left. And swing voters might have been put off by that. But she's done a good job, at least for now. And there'll be a big assault coming politically and so forth, so we don't know. But for now, she's done a good job of being centrist enough, moderate enough, forward-looking enough, personally attractive enough as a candidate that she seems to have reassured a lot of those potential swing voters. And one of the big questions, though, which you kind of hinted at, was how many more voters are there? 5%? And are Would these you people, give back some of those 6%? That's a huge question.
Are these people who for a while were going to Trump, or are these people who just were staying home, not planning to vote?
Some of both. And I'd say there really are probably two categories of these swing voters. One is politically engaged people, often middle class, upper middle class, maybe traditionally Republican, but more McCain, Mitt Romney type Republicans, uncomfortable with Trump, not crazy about the Democratic Party, especially its left wing. So that's a certain type of voter that we're pretty familiar with, suburban middle-class voters. They're also politically unengaged and not very well-informed voters who don't pay much attention to politics. They weren't paying much attention. The one thing they knew is that Biden was too old. They probably were just going to stay home. They didn't love Trump either. But some of them liked some aspects of Trump's message, probably. They looked up. There's Harris. They don't know anything about her. I mean, she's a vice president, but not a very well-known one. And she hadn't stayed in the primaries in 2019, 2020 to ever get on the ballot, to go to the actual voters. So she's never, people hadn't had to really focus on her, you might say. They looked up. They thought, well, Harris seems younger than Biden. They watched 5 minutes or 3 minutes or 30 seconds of a speech. She seemed articulate. They read a little bit maybe, or saw stuff on social media. She seemed pretty sensible, non-threatening. And I think some of those voters, some of that 6% is those kinds of voters. And in each case, you can say, well, the Trump people aren't foolish. They see those same numbers, and they're going to try to pry those voters back to Trump.
So for months and months, we've been saying on this show that this is a base election. Now, unless I'm misreading it, you're telling me, no, this is actually a fight for the undecideds or the movables in the middle.
So I think some of both, but I think at this point with Harris and Trump, there's 45% basically baked in for either of them, and I think they can turn out their voters. I think Biden might have had a problem with that, which is one reason Trump was ahead of Biden. He was losing traditional Democratic voters. I think Harris has got those back for now, and I think probably keeps them back. So now we are in a fight for the middle, and that middle isn't huge, but obviously if it's 6, 8, 10%, it's enough to swing the election.
So let's go back to this switch from Biden to Harris. And what does that say nationally? You've talked about how it energizes and gets people involved that weren't involved. What themes do we expect to hear more from Harris than Biden? And who is Tim Walz, and will he make a difference?
I don't think substantively the Harris agenda is particularly different from the Biden agenda. They're both pretty standard center-left, I would say, Democratic agendas at home and abroad. Pretty standard, actually, new standard for the Democrats, maybe internationalist agendas, maybe slight differences on the Middle East, but I think pretty slight, honestly. She has been Biden's vice president, after all, and she's not publicly, or even so far as we know, privately dissented from much of the Biden administration. So I think in terms of the agenda, pretty similar, but I think in terms of the approach, pretty different. Biden's the incumbent president. And like all incumbent presidents, I work for one, they want to defend their record. And they sort of have to defend their record because that's what people are voting on. And people say, you messed up inflation, you messed up Afghanistan, I don't like what you're doing in the Middle East. And if you're president or if you're the president's team, you've got to say, wait, you misunderstand. He did a better job than you think. Harris is part of the administration, so she has to do some of that. But she is much freer to be a forward-looking candidate. And indeed, I would even say for her, one of the key things she has to do is make herself the future and Trump the past. Trump is backward-looking, and he literally was president already. I'm the future. I'm 20 years younger. A black woman is part of that, I think, the new America. I have an agenda for the future. I welcome the future and want to shape it. Trump is nostalgic for some past that never existed and bitter about the president and has no vision of the future. I think that will be really central to her message. It sounds a little simple-minded almost, new versus old, future versus past, forward versus going backwards. But, you know, those kinds of things do matter in politics. We've seen that in many, many elections around the world, right? And it's basically better to be the future than the past, I would say. And so I think Harris will really lean in on that. On the pick of Governor Walz, I mean, it is kind of amazing. I mean, he was not known at all. He had some interviews and did very well. And turns out to be a personally sort of attractive and affable, maybe somewhat reassuring governor who also isn't at odds with any part of the party. I mean, he's not particularly left-wing, really. He's governor of a liberal state, so he's pretty liberal. He certainly hasn't taken on the left the way Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, for example, has on a few issues. I think Harris both thought he was probably a safe pick, but also I gather the chemistry was good, and he is a middle American type. You know, the Democratic Party's image, somewhat fairly, is the two coasts, elites from the two coasts. You want Harvard Law School, you want Yale Law School, you want the Ivy League, you want high-priced law firms interspersed with government service. That's your Democratic nominees, you know. I mean, or intellectual types or whatever, right? I mean, sort of very coastal and elite. And that's hurt the Democrats, obviously. Tim Walz is not that. He went to a small state college in Minnesota. He's from Nebraska originally, went to college, I think, in Nebraska, and then in Minnesota, taught high school. Not a fancy law professor, you know, taught high school like Barack Obama was sort of or something. Taught high school for 20 years, was a football coach, very kind of beloved, it seems, by his students and his colleagues there. Gets into politics, is a member of Congress for, I think, 12, 14 years, something like that. Not a super prominent one, but a well-liked one and respected one. And then governor of a kind of middle American state where he focuses on very down-to-earth things, school lunch programs, the right to repair. This is a funny thing. I didn't even know what it was. Someone mentioned it to me about 2 months ago. You know, if you buy something from a refrigerator or anything, you know, coffee maker, often they sort of, you can't get it repaired at some place you want to get it repaired. You have to bring it back to the manufacturer. That's what the warranty covers and stuff. And a lot of people have said this is kind of a, you know, a way in which big business tries to stop you from going to some local hardware store and getting some easy thing done. And so let's save money, let's help local hardware stores. And so he passed that in Minnesota. And it turns out people really like that, you know, that you don't get locked into these kinds, you know. So it's just little things like, little's not fair, but you know, medium-sized things like that he's done. And so he seems to be a pretty popular governor. And his launch of his campaign was pretty successful. And they're an interesting ticket, right? As I say, I mean, the one thing against Josh Shapiro, who I think is very, very talented.
This is the governor of Pennsylvania.
Sorry, the governor of Pennsylvania. Very talented, younger, more dynamic than Walz, I would say. Someone who was spoken about as a possible president in a way that Walz really never has been, really. He's a East Coast, Philadelphia, you know, lawyer. Kamala Harris is a West Coast, San Francisco lawyer. And if you're running a Democratic campaign, there is some some good sense to not having a Philadelphia and San Francisco ticket, you know, and well-educated lawyers. I mean, not that Tim Walz isn't well-educated, but let's have someone from the middle of the country who taught high school. And
so who does he help? How does he help Kamala Harris?
So I think mostly he doesn't hurt, honestly. I think she has to win this campaign. I mean, people don't vote much for vice president or against vice president anyway. And in his case in particular, I would say Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, former speaker, who's a very shrewd political operator, was for Walz, I gather, and apparently told colleagues she thought he could help reassure some sort of older white voters in the Midwest, maybe older white males, a little bit like Kamala Harris, black woman, a little, you know, California. Is that quite right? It's like, oh yeah, Walz, he looks kind of like my uncle, or he looks like my brother-in-law.
He definitely looks older than his 60s.
It's crazy. They're the same age.
She looks almost
they look 20 years
age.
apart. I know.
Exactly. You know.
It's funny, but he's a hunter. He fixes things in his garage. I mean, I think there's a certain. Now look, do people ultimately vote on that? Not much, actually. They vote on more substantial things in a way, and other issues. But I think it does take the edge, you might say, off. If you're going to nominate the first black female to be president of the United States, you probably do want to make it easier for voters who are a little bit wary of that, even if they shouldn't be, to come on over.
Interesting. All right. Actually, I saw this terrific video of Walz with a young woman at a barbecue. She says, "Oh, I'm a vegetarian. Is there anything here for me?" And he says, "Sure. Come and have the chicken kebab." What does
That's his daughter.
Is that his daughter?
Yeah, his grown, like 23-year-old daughter, who's a vegetarian, right?
Right.
And so he thinks chicken
is close enough.
Yeah, exactly. It's not beef, you know.
All right. When we come back after the break, we're going to continue our discussion with Bill Kristol about this earthquake of change in American politics and what we can expect on the mad dash to November in just a moment. Again, my guest today is Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol, journalist, editor, publisher, policymaker, current editor-in-chief of thebulwark.com, founder of the Weekly Standard, all the way back to the White House when I was a young man. Delighted to have you with us, Bill.
Good to be with you. Thanks for making me feel so old, but that's okay. Thank you, Rob.
Walz looks older than you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So we've talked about Harris and Trump. Just for a moment, Walz versus J.D. Vance. Quite a bit of a contrast here.
There is. Vance is 20 years younger, Yale Law School, very smart, kind of well-read in a slightly weird way. He's read a lot of right-wing stuff in American history and political philosophy, for that matter. Two very, very different styles. Walz avuncular and reassuring, Vance aggressive, but maybe a little bit off-putting.
The other big event was, of course, the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, which for a moment was itself transformative. Surviving defiantly, standing up, becoming that image will be in history books, for decades. Any lingering impact of this?
I mean, I'm surprised by the degree to which it seems to have gotten into the rearview mirror. Obviously, if he'd been hurt badly or, God forbid, killed, it would be a whole different story. But people do tend to, I guess, shrug it off if you get, other people got hurt badly and killed, but he was very fortunate, and so it didn't change anything. He showed up at the convention, 2 days later with a bandage, and, so people, I think, have moved beyond it more than I would have expected. I would have thought it would have changed the dynamics. That may be partly that he didn't let it change the dynamics, though. I think he had a moment there where he could have spoken eloquently about there's too much violence in our country, and I think, I was almost the victim here. Many others have been victims, many kids in schools and people on the streets, and we need to get serious about everything from being anti-crime, a more traditional Republican message, but also about some of the guns that are out there. You can imagine a world in which Trump turns this into a defining moment for his campaign, but he didn't do that. And really, by his acceptance speech Thursday night at the Republican convention, he talked about it for a while, mostly as a kind of personal narrative, and then he just forgot about it, and he hasn't talked about it much, to my knowledge, since then. J.D. Vance, his vice presidential pick, has, in the course of lamenting how unfairly Trump has allegedly been treated. And said, they've tried to put him in jail, they tried to prosecute him, they tried to impeach him, and now they've tried to kill him, which is really a demagogic and terrible thing to say, as if what the Biden campaign was somehow associated with this disturbed young man who tried to assassinate Trump. Apparently he was looking for people to assassinate. Trump was the one who came to near where he lived in Pennsylvania. So, so there's a little attempt there to demagogically blame the left and the Democrats for this assassination attempt, but it's so far removed from the fact that I don't think it has much impact.
So you did just raise implicitly this imagery of Kamala Harris, the prosecutor, and Donald Trump, the felon. Is this going to be the Democratic talking point? Is it a winning talking point, or does it remind voters that, oh, they're just going after Trump because Trump, likes to talk big, but that's not really the issues.
Right. I think we don't know. I mean, I think the convicted felon thing has not hurt Trump, and I don't really see why it will hurt him just because that's the prosecutor running against him. So I think that side of it probably doesn't matter. I think Harris being a prosecutor, though, might matter. She has an ad up where she makes a point of how her campaign makes a point of how she prosecuted both violent criminals and sexual criminals, but also big corporations that were breaking the law. And it's not a bad way, if you're a Democrat, to combine a kind of economic populism, anti-big business to some degree, and tough on crime message, which the Democrats need, because certainly they've always been attacked by the Republicans for being soft on crime, and that's going to certainly be a theme of the Trump campaign. So I think she will emphasize that she's a prosecutor. I'm not sure how much the flip side of it, that he's a felon, really matters.
We've seen, since all these changes, we've seen an enormous amount of money flowing into both campaigns. After the assassination attempt, enormous funds to Trump. After the shift from Biden to Harris, enormous amounts of money going to the Harris campaign. What are they going to do so flush with cash?
They're going to spend it on endless television ads, digital ads. You're not going to be able to go to any website that has anything to do with politics, or not with politics, incidentally, because they need to get to the voters who don't care about politics, and not see Harris and Trump banners and ads. You're not going to be able to watch a Philadelphia Phillies game. That's the baseball team in Philly, obviously, but same with the Detroit Tigers. Any baseball or team, any football team, any college football team in any of the swing states in September and October, you're not going to be able to watch a game without seeing ads for both campaigns. At some point, when there's this much money, it presumably kind of cancels each other. They cancel each other out. It becomes, people get tired of it, actually. So maybe the amount of money, ironically, makes the money less important in a funny way, right? If you have a 50 million versus 5 million advantage in a race in America and for the Senate, you're in very, very good shape. If it's 750 million versus 650 million, or I'm making up the numbers, but you get the idea, doesn't matter that much, So, but there will be plenty of money for them to test every message, get every message out there. I think, though, Trump, everyone knows everything. Harris, people are getting to know.
Just a word to remind our viewers that in addition to the presidential election, the entire House of Representatives, a third of the Senate, will be on the ballot in November. So, Bill, we've had so many surprises. Are we going to have any more in the next 2 months?
I had this conversation with James Carville the other day, and the first thing he said was, I hate to even speculate or predict, because it sort of looks like it's set. It sort of looks like there you got Trump and Vance, Harris and Walz. Looks like the issues are kind of, clear. But I don't know. It looked like it was set 2 months ago, and it turned out not to be. So, yeah, I don't know what unknown unknowns could be out there.
All right. Bill Kristol, thank you so much for helping to explain the inexplicable to our viewers in the Middle East. Thank you for joining me this week on Dakhel, Washington.
My pleasure.
وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو استفسارات، وخاصة حول سلطة المال في السياسة الأمريكية الحالية، أرجو أن تتصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. أراكم في الأسبوع المقبل، وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.